When Nolan Hayes walked into the Whitmore Gala alone, the laughter started before he reached the second step. His suit was old, his truck was parked outside the valet line, and the empty chair at his side told the room everything it thought it needed to know. "No one came with you," a director named Gavin Crowley called out, loud enough for the nearest 100 guests to hear, loud enough to carry above the orchestra and the crystal and the scent of money that had never once questioned itself. Nolan closed his hand around the invitation in his jacket pocket and almost turned back. Then Celeste Whitmore stepped off the main staircase, crossed the ballroom floor, and took his arm. She said 4 words that silenced the room completely. "Stay until the end to find out why the CEO chose the man every person in that room had just laughed at." The Crown Meridian Hotel had been rebuilt twice since August Whitmore first opened it in the 1960s, but the ballroom had never changed in any way that mattered. The same cathedral ceilings, the same Italian marble that turned every footstep into an announcement, the same atmosphere of inherited certainty that made newcomers feel the walls themselves were assessing them. Tonight, Whitmore Crown Holdings had filled every table for the Centennial Gala, drawing Charlotte's full constellation of financial power. Developers, investors whose names appeared on buildings rather than deeds, journalists who covered wealth without questioning it. The event had been marketed as the night Celeste Whitmore would unveil the largest expansion in company history. A mixed-use tower called Crown Horizon that would reshape the city's skyline. What most guests did not know, and what every board member understood completely, was that Celeste had been given an additional task for the evening, one that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with keeping the family's controlling interest intact. Nolan Hayes arrived in a pickup truck that had 200,000 miles on it and a scratch along the passenger door that Lillian had put there with a bicycle handlebar 8 years ago and that he had never bothered to fix. He parked it himself, ignored the look the valet gave him, and walked through the front entrance with the kind of stillness that comes not from confidence in the room, but from having survived things the room could not imagine. His suit was charcoal gray and well cut, though it dated from the last time he had needed formal wear, the day he had lowered his wife into the ground. He had not bought another since because he had not expected to need one, and when the invitation arrived 3 weeks ago with Celeste Whitmore's personal security code printed in the lower corner, he had stood at his kitchen table for a long time before placing it back in the envelope and finishing his coffee. He was 41 years old, and he had not set foot in anything connected to Whitmore Crown Holdings in 7 years, and the only reason he was here was that the man who had once asked his forgiveness was now dead, and the letter left behind had said his name. The reception staff at the entrance gave his name a longer pause than it warranted, scanning the guest list before finding it. Listed simply as Hayes Architectural Restoration, the small firm he ran out of a converted workshop on the south edge of the city, where he spent his days returning old buildings to what they had once been. The confirmation code cleared the hesitation, but not before he registered the precise nature of the doubt on the clerk's face. Inside, the room did its own recalibrating. A few faces turned when he entered, and a smaller number stayed turned, the ones who had been in the industry long enough to remember his name in a different context, not from a business card but from the kind of story that circulated in professional circles for years after its official conclusion, the kind with a name that became shorthand for a specific category of failure. Gavin Crowley had been a vice president at a competing firm during the Crown Harbor Tower incident, and had since built a career on the premise that knowing what had happened to other people's careers was a form of competitive intelligence. He was 53, loud in the manner of men who had never been asked to be quiet, and standing near the central bar when Nolan crossed the floor toward the seating chart. He raised his voice to a register clearly meant to carry. He said that the suit looked like it had seen better decades, and then asked whether Nolan had come alone because no one could be persuaded to join him or because he simply preferred the company of rooms he no longer belonged in. Several people laughed. Not all of them, but the nervous, performative kind from people who understood that agreeing with the powerful man was safer than silence. A woman nearby said something that included the words Crown Harbor, and the person beside her nodded with the expression of someone confirming a rumor they had always found satisfying. Nolan did not respond. He stood where he was and looked up at the center of the ballroom ceiling, where the Whitmore Crown emblem hung on a thin wire like a chandelier of corporate mythology. The interlocking W and C that had represented quality and permanence for 100 years, or so the story went. He had believed that story once. He had built his professional life around it. He considered, seriously for the second time that evening, leaving. He took one step toward the exit. In the pocket of his jacket, the envelope pressed against his ribs the way it had all evening. A physical reminder that the drawings inside it were not just his evidence, but someone's final reckoning, and the person who needed to see them most had not yet entered the room. Gavin Crowley was not finished. Emboldened by his earlier response, he said loudly that it must be a particular kind of loneliness to show up to a room like this without someone willing to stand beside you, and that certain reputations had a way of making that loneliness permanent. He did not use Claire's name. He did not know it. Almost no one in this room knew it, because the settlement agreement Nolan had signed had been designed, in part, to ensure that the woman who had died in that building while doing her job was reduced, in the public record, to an unnamed casualty in a footnote about contractor liability. A woman with silver earrings said, in a voice pitched at conversational range, that she had read the original reporting and that the engineering review had been quite clear about where the fault lay. The small cluster nearest to Nolan shifted almost imperceptibly in the way that signals someone has been designated as a person the room has already processed and set aside. Nolan turned to face the room and said, without heat, that he had not come here to find company, and that he was not interested in relitigating something that a number of people in this building already knew the truth about. It was not a long speech. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has stopped caring whether he is believed and started caring only about whether he is accurate. Several people looked uncomfortable. Crowley opened his mouth again, and the expression on his face suggested that the comfort of the room was in his favor, and he intended to use it further. He did not get the chance. Celeste Whitmore appeared at the top of the main staircase in a navy dress, chosen to make the wearer look like someone who had always been the most important person in any given room. She was 38 and had been CEO of Whitmore Crown Holdings for 4 years. 4 years during which the board had questioned every significant decision she made in ways they had never questioned her father or his father. 4 years during which she had learned to calculate not just the business implications of her choices, but the optics, the positioning, the secondary effects on how she was perceived by people who had decided before she opened her mouth that she was there because of her last name and would fail for the same reason. She descended the staircase, scanning the room with the kind of attention that most people in this space directed inward, toward their own performances, and she saw Nolan Hayes standing in the center of a social arrangement that she recognized immediately because she had experienced its equivalent more times than she would ever describe to anyone. Preston Blackwell appeared at her elbow from a side corridor, moving with the fluid assurance of a man who believed he controlled the geometry of every space he entered. He was 46, lean in the way of men who worked at their appearance the way they worked at their finances, with discipline and a private understanding that the effort was an investment, and he had been Celeste's designated partner for this evening in both the public and the structural sense. he said, in a low voice that assumed she would agree with him, that the Hayes situation was a communications problem and that security could handle it without drawing attention. Celeste did not look at him. She was already moving, already coming down the last 3 steps and crossing the ballroom floor with a directness that parted the crowd, the way intention always parts people who are not sure what is happening yet. The room watched. The room expected a specific outcome. The CEO would thank Nolan for attending, a security professional would appear, and the disruption would be resolved in the manner that disruptions were always resolved in rooms like this. Quietly, efficiently, and in favor of the people who belonged. She stopped in front of Nolan Hayes, and the two of them looked at each other for a moment in a way that suggested a history that no one in the room could identify. Then Celeste Whitmore reached out and took his arm, and she turned to face the room, and she said in a voice that required no microphone and carried to every corner of the ballroom, that Nolan Hayes had not come alone this evening, and that for the remainder of the night he was with her. The room went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when the expected ending has been replaced by something no one prepared for. Preston's jaw did not move. Gavin Crowley found something to study in his champagne glass. The woman with the silver earrings appeared to be reconsidering her earlier statement in real time. Celeste guided Nolan toward the head table with the calm of someone completing a task she had thought through entirely, and she placed him in the seat to her right. The seat that, by the placement cards arranged 2 days earlier by her assistant under Preston's supervision, had been assigned to Preston himself. It was only when the noise of the room had settled back into its professional murmur, when the cameras had turned away and the small dramas of the nearest tables had resumed their normal rotation, that Celeste leaned close enough to Nolan to speak beneath the orchestra. She did not look at him when she said it. She said that she had not done what she just did in order to protect him, and that he should understand, clearly, that she needed to know why her father had put his name in a private document that was not discoverable by anyone connected to this company, and that the conversation they were going to have tonight was not optional. Nolan said nothing for a moment. Then he said he understood, and that he had brought something she needed to see, and that he was willing to have that conversation on one condition, that she was prepared for the answer. August Whitmore had died 14 months ago from a condition diagnosed too late and managed too slowly, and in the weeks after his death, as Celeste and the family's legal team worked through the estate documentation, they had found an envelope in a secondary safe that August had established at a private bank under his own name alone, not through the family trust or any corporate account, but through the kind of personal arrangement a man makes when he wants certain things to survive him without interference. The outside bore a single line in August's handwriting, to be opened when Blackwell becomes family. Celeste had understood the instruction precisely and had put the envelope back and left it there for almost a year, until Preston Blackwell had begun applying the specific kind of pressure that revealed itself not as affection but as leverage. Quiet references to the board's concerns about her leadership, suggestions that a formal partnership with Blackwell Capital would resolve questions of financial stability she had not known were being asked. An engagement announcement drafted and waiting that appeared in her inbox one morning, as though its existence were already settled. She had gone to the bank the following afternoon and opened the envelope alone. Inside, on a single folded sheet in the same handwriting, August had written Nolan Hayes's name and a storage code, and below that, 4 sentences that had changed the nature of everything Celeste thought she knew about her inheritance. The sentences said that Nolan Hayes had known the truth about Crown Harbor Tower and had been prevented from speaking it, that the truth was preserved in a secure archive, that no agreement involving Blackwell Capital or Blackwell Engineering should be finalized before Celeste had heard what Nolan Hayes had to say, and that August was sorry for the specific nature of his cowardice, which he named without euphemism. Celeste had sat with the letter for a long time before she sent the invitation. She had not told the board. She had not told Elise, her legal counsel, until the morning of the gala. She had constructed a plausible reason for Nolan's presence, independent technical advisor for the Crown Horizon Structural Review, that she knew would hold for one evening if no one examined it closely, and she had calculated that one evening was all she needed. Now, seated at the head table with Preston watching from 3 seats away, and Nolan's jacket pocket outlined with the shape of something flat and rectangular, Celeste asked Nolan whether her father had known that the original design for Crown Harbor Tower had been altered. Nolan's answer was not immediate. He looked at the model of Crown Horizon displayed on the stage at the far end of the room, a gleaming representation of everything the company intended to build next, all clean angles and confident scale, and he said that August had known enough to be afraid, which was not the same as knowing everything, but was also not the same as innocence. Celeste asked what that meant specifically. Nolan said it meant that August had chosen, at a critical moment, to let fear make the decision that his conscience could not. Preston appeared beside the table before Celeste could respond, with the smooth arrival of a man who had been watching the conversation from across the room and had calculated exactly how long to let it develop before interrupting. He said, with the cordiality of someone performing cordiality rather than experiencing it, that he was curious what professional capacity had brought a restoration specialist to the head table at a hospitality and real estate event. Celeste said, without inflection, that Nolan's firm had been engaged to advise on the structural integrity review for Crown Horizon. Preston looked at Nolan for a moment with the expression of a man processing a variable that had not been in his model, and then he returned to his table. Nolan watched him go and then looked back at the Crown Horizon model on the stage. From where he sat, he could see the sectional rendering of the foundation system, the layered load distribution that was supposed to represent an advance on everything the company had built before. He recognized it because he had seen its predecessor. Not in a presentation or a briefing document, but in the actual structure of Crown Harbor Tower, in the way the concrete had behaved under pressure in a test that was supposed to be routine, in the precise manner in which a section of subfloor support had given way in the 40 seconds that had changed every subsequent calculation of his life. The foundation approach in the Crown Horizon model used the same design logic, the same cost-optimized geometry, the same load pathway assumptions that the original specifications for Crown Harbor had rejected before someone had replaced them. He asked Celeste, without raising his voice, who had approved the structural system for Crown Horizon. She told him the engineering approval had come from Blackwell Engineering, Preston's firm, retained as a subcontractor on the basis of their prior relationship with the company. Nolan did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that what had happened 7 years ago was not finished. It had simply been waiting for a second building. 7 years ago, Nolan Hayes had been the lead structural engineer on Crown Harbor Tower, a 44-story mixed-use development that was supposed to be the most technically sophisticated project in Whitmore Crown's history. He had been 34, recently promoted, in possession of a professional reputation built on the unglamorous virtues of accuracy and caution. His original design had been vetted through 3 independent reviews and had passed all of them at a cost that was approximately 18% higher than the budget parameters Preston Blackwell's firm had proposed. Preston, who at the time was operating Blackwell Engineering as a construction materials supplier and subcontractor to the Whitmore Group, had presented an alternative materials specification that reduced that gap substantially. substituting certain load-bearing components with lighter, cheaper variants whose performance data, he argued, had been validated by internal testing. Nolan had reviewed the substitution proposal twice and declined to approve it both times, in writing, with technical annotations that he kept copies of. He had been told by a senior vice president he did not see in this ballroom tonight, because the man had retired to another state, that the decision would be escalated. He had assumed escalation meant review. Instead, it had meant replacement. 3 weeks after his second written refusal, a revised version of the structural design file appeared in the project management system under his professional credentials and digital signature, incorporating every material substitution he had rejected. Nolan discovered the altered file on a Tuesday and spent that evening drafting an urgent report to the project director with timestamps and access logs attached. On Thursday, before the report had been formally acknowledged, a subfloor support section in a closed area of the building failed during a scheduled load test. Claire Hayes was a certified structural testing specialist contracted independently by Whitmore Crown's Quality Assurance Division, and she was among the 4 people in the area of the failure. 2 survived. 2 did not. Claire was 33. Lillian was 8. The subsequent review was swift by the standards of these things, which meant it was not an investigation, but a process of documentation. A careful assembly of materials that pointed toward the conclusion that had already been selected. Nolan's professional signature on the altered design file was treated as the primary piece of evidence. The prior refusals were not part of the public record. The access logs that would have shown when and from which terminal the file had been modified were described in the official report as incomplete due to a system migration that had occurred during the project period. August Whitmore had met with Nolan privately, in an office with no assistants and no recording, 12 days after Claire's death. August had not offered excuses. He had said that he was aware of what had actually occurred, that he was also aware of what he had allowed to occur in the aftermath, and that he understood there was no adequate response to the situation except honesty, which he was not going to be able to provide publicly, because the company could not survive the exposure at that moment, not with Blackwell Capital holding the primary financing line and the board's agreement already in place for a structure of liability that had Nolan's name at its center. He had said he was sorry. He had said it more than once. Nolan had sat across from him and understood that August's guilt was genuine and also completely useless. The settlement agreement had been negotiated with efficiency that Nolan, in retrospect, recognized as the efficiency of people who had done this before. He received financial provision for Lillian's care and education through her 18th year, and a non-disclosure agreement covering all aspects of the Crown Harbor incident, including Claire's presence at the site. In exchange, he withdrew the internal report and agreed not to pursue civil or criminal action against any party. He had signed because Lillian was 8 and had just lost her mother, and because the company's legal team had made it sufficiently clear that a contested suit would take 4 to 7 years and would keep Claire's name in the news in ways that would follow Lillian to school and to every quiet moment she might otherwise have had. He had not signed because he agreed with what had been done. He had signed because he was a father, and he had calculated correctly that the only thing he could protect at that moment was his daughter. Before leaving the building, he had backed up the original design files, the access logs he had preserved before the official record was closed, and his written refusals to a storage device that he had kept in a fireproof lockbox in his workshop for 7 years, waiting for a use that he had almost stopped believing would ever arrive. The one thing he had not known, until August's letter revealed it, was that August had also preserved a record, a separate archive assembled over years, containing materials whose existence Nolan had not been aware of, Materials that went beyond Nolan's own documentation in ways that August, apparently, had spent the last years of his life arranging into a coherent form. Celeste's first response to the full account was silence. Not the theatrical silence of someone performing shock, but the quiet of a person recalculating every assumption that has organized their understanding of something important. She sat with it for almost a minute before she said that she did not want to believe her father had known and had chosen silence. Nolan told her that he understood the desire not to believe it, and that it did not change what was true, and that August had been a more complicated person than the version of him that a daughter needed him to be, not a villain, not a coward in the simple sense, but a man who had loved his company more than his conscience at a specific moment, and had spent the rest of his life trying to find a way to balance that equation without destroying everything he had built. Celeste said, very quietly, that she had read the original reporting on Crown Harbor and had believed it. She said she owed him something for that. Nolan said she owed him nothing, that the reporting had been designed to be believed, and that the only thing he needed from her now was for her to understand what was in the envelope he had brought with him and what it meant for Crown Horizon. Celeste had Elise Bennett meet her in a private conference suite on the 4th floor at 9:15. Elise reviewed the storage code from August's letter, cross-referenced it with bank records, and made 3 calls before confirming that the code corresponded to a secondary secure archive at the same private bank, maintained under a separate instrument in August Whitmore's personal name alone. She also reported something else. The primary safe, the one that had contained the letter, had been accessed 3 days before the gala. The authorization on the access record bore Thaddeus Whitmore's signature. Preston had been watching the conference suite from the lobby level with the patience of someone who had constructed a long game and was monitoring it for the signs that it was accelerating ahead of schedule. When Celeste returned to the ballroom with Nolan beside her, and Elise's expression carrying the specific tension of legal counsel who has learned something that changes the nature of the situation, Preston identified the variable shift immediately. He moved to the board members' cluster at the far end of the room and said something that, within 10 minutes, had generated a formal request from 2 board directors that Nolan Hayes be asked to leave the premises, on the grounds that his presence constituted a potential liability exposure given the outstanding question of his settlement agreement, and that his continued association with Celeste at the head table was generating speculative coverage on the industry circuits that could affect investor sentiment before the Crown Horizon announcement. Celeste was informed of the request at the table by a board liaison. She looked at it for a moment, then set it face down. She stood and she took Nolan's arm again, not for the benefit of anyone watching, though people were watching, but because the geometry of the moment required her to make a decision rather than let others make it for her. And she guided him to the staging area beside the main platform, placing them both in a position that made any attempt to remove him publicly impossible without also publicly removing the CEO. Nolan said, in a low voice, that he did not want to be someone's statement. He said he had a daughter at home and that he had spent 7 years making certain decisions in order to keep her life from being organized around what had happened to her mother, and that being in the middle of someone else's power struggle was not a situation he had agreed to. Celeste said she understood that, and that she was sorry, genuinely, for the position she had put him in, and that what she was about to do was her choice, and its consequences would fall on her. He said that was not something she could guarantee. She said no, it wasn't. The conference room adjacent to the main ballroom was small, executive appointed, and capable of being sealed from the inside, which Celeste confirmed before she asked Thaddeus Whitmore, directly, what he had removed from August's safe 3 days ago. Thaddeus was 68 and had run the board's operational committee for 9 years with the specific skill of a man who knew which information to hold and which to release. He said he had opened the safe to protect her, that the materials inside were honest, but that honesty released without strategy would cost the company its equity position and possibly its ability to operate at all. He said that hundreds of employees held jobs whose continuity depended on careful decisions rather than reflexive ones, and that August had understood this and had struggled with it and had tried to resolve it posthumously in a manner Thaddeus considered unwise. Nolan said he needed Thaddeus to clarify something. He said he needed to know whether Thaddeus had been aware, at the time of the Crown Harbor incident, that the design files had been altered before the failure. Thaddeus did not answer that question, which was itself an answer. Nolan asked whether Thaddeus had known that the settlement agreement with Nolan had included provisions to exclude Claire's name from the public record. Thaddeus said that those decisions had been made by legal counsel and by the board, and that he had not been the primary decision-maker. Nolan said he understood what the word primary was doing in that sentence. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Preston Blackwell opened the door without knocking and entered with the ease of someone who was accustomed to rooms in which he had not been invited and who had learned over a long career that the people already in the room rarely asked him to leave. Preston said he had been patient, and he believed patience had run its course. He said he had possession of the materials from August's safe. He did not explain how he had obtained them from Thaddeus, and Thaddeus did not look at anyone, and that those materials, if released through the wrong channels, would assign liability in ways that would be catastrophic for the Whitmore family's personal legal exposure, not just the company's. He said that the correct resolution was the one that had already been arranged, a formal announcement of the merger between Whitmore Crown Holdings and Blackwell Capital, accompanied by the engagement of Celeste and himself, which would consolidate share structure in a manner that made any further legal challenge structurally unprofitable for any plaintiff. He said this with the calm of someone explaining mathematics. He said Celeste needed to understand that this was not a threat. It was a description of the situation as it existed, and that her options within that situation were limited, and that the announcement should happen before midnight. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. She said that she had been told at various points in her career that she was managing a fragile situation and that the responsible choice was caution and patience and the management of information rather than its release. She said she had spent 4 years running this company on the premise that those advisors were right. She said she was no longer confident they were. She asked Nolan, without looking away from Preston, whether there was any scenario in which the structural problem in Crown Horizon could be resolved without stopping the project entirely. Nolan said no. He said the foundation system was the project. You could not fix it with a change order. Celeste said she understood. Preston said she was about to make the most expensive mistake of her professional life, and possibly her personal one. Celeste said she was aware that this was the kind of thing people said when they wanted a decision reversed, and that she appreciated the consistency. She asked Nolan, before they left the conference room, why he was still working to prevent something that a company he had no reason to trust was about to build in a city he could have walked away from. Nolan said he was not doing it for the company. He said he was an engineer, and there were people who would eventually walk into Crown Horizon's lobby and ride its elevators and work at its desks, and that none of those people had made any choice that should put them at risk. He said that was the calculation. It had always been the calculation. The job was to make buildings that did not kill people, and when someone prevented that from happening, the job was to try again. Celeste stood up. Preston said something about the original drawings. He said that Hayes Architectural Restoration had experienced a break-in the previous night, and that Nolan's workstation and several storage devices had been removed, and that the original design files he had been relying on as evidence no longer had a home. Nolan looked at him and said, with the mild tone of someone correcting a minor factual error, that whoever had broken into his workshop had taken the wrong copy. The Crown Meridian's main ballroom had not grown quieter during the hours that the evening's principal drama had been playing out in its conference rooms and side corridors. If anything, the social energy had intensified in the way that social energy always does when the guests understand that something significant is occurring beyond what they can directly observe. Rumors had already circulated twice and been revised twice. The version currently most accepted was that Celeste and Preston had disagreed about the announcement timeline, which was partially accurate in the way that certain surfaces are partially maps of the territory underneath. Preston stepped onto the stage platform at 10:47, ahead of the scheduled program, with the composure of a man who had decided that the variable of Celeste's current position was manageable and that moving ahead of her was the better tactical choice. He announced, to applause from the board members' tables and cautious appreciation from the larger room, that Blackwell Capital and Whitmore Crown Holdings had reached a preliminary agreement on a transformative merger, that Crown Horizon would move forward under a unified ownership structure, and that a personal announcement of significance would follow the formal signing. He mentioned Celeste by name twice, each time in the possessive context that a man uses when he is announcing a transaction rather than a relationship. The document was brought to the stage. Board members stood. The cameras turned toward the main entrance where Celeste was expected to appear. She appeared with Nolan beside her, and the cameras stayed on them because the image they presented was not the image that had been arranged. Celeste walked to the stage and stood before the microphone and did not touch the document in front of her. She announced, in precise language that Elise had helped her calibrate in the 15 minutes before this moment, that Crown Horizon was being placed under an independent structural review effective immediately, that the board of directors had been formally notified of concerns regarding the engineering approval process, and that the company would be requesting a full audit of all current contracts involving Blackwell Engineering. She announced that the merger agreement would not be signed until the audit's completion. The applause that had been present in the room dissolved into the kind of silence that is not absence of sound but presence of attention. Preston said, loudly enough that the microphone picked it up, that this was the result of manipulation by a discredited engineer who had signed away his right to make any claim against this company 7 years ago. He moved to a screen on the side of the stage and displayed, at visible scale, the settlement agreement with Nolan's signature at the bottom, intended to read as a permanent admission, as the record of a man who had accepted money in exchange for the story the company had always told about Crown Harbor Tower. Nolan stepped to the second microphone and said that he had signed that document. He said that when he had signed it, he had recently buried his wife, and his daughter was 8 years old, and that the alternative to signing had been a legal process designed to exhaust him financially over years, and that he had made the choice that a parent makes when a parent has no good choices, the one that protected the child. He said he had lived with that choice for 7 years and did not ask anyone to find it sympathetic, because it was not a sympathetic story. It was the story of what had happened when a man with accurate information and no resources had encountered a company with inaccurate information and unlimited ones. He did not raise his voice. He did not address the legal arguments or the financial consequences or the technical specifics of what he had brought with him in the envelope. He simply stood there and told the truth in the particular way that people who have been carrying something for a very long time tell the truth, not as a performance, not as a strategy, but because it is the last thing remaining once everything else has been stripped away. Celeste stepped to his side. She did not take his arm this time. She stood beside him and she said into her microphone that Whitmore Crown Holdings had applied financial pressure and legal leverage to obtain Nolan Hayes's signature on an agreement that it was not entitled to, and that she was acknowledging this publicly on behalf of the company, and that it was the beginning of a correction rather than the end of one. Preston said something from the side of the stage that was no longer the most interesting thing in the room. Elise appeared at the entrance to the main ballroom with a tablet and a specific expression. The board meeting was called for 11:15 in the hotel's secondary conference center, and its atmosphere was the specific atmosphere of institutional crisis. The combination of adrenaline and proceduralism that occurs when powerful people suddenly need to be seen making decisions. Preston opened with a formal motion to relieve Celeste of her operational authority, pending an independent review of her conduct in the evening's events, citing damage to investor confidence and unilateral deviation from the board-approved agenda. He had 9 pre-committed votes and needed 11 for a majority, and 3 of the 14 board members were currently uncommitted in the specific way that people become uncommitted when they sense that the weight of a room is shifting and want to know which side of the shift they should be standing on. Thaddeus sat at the far end of the table in the posture of a man who had arrived at a consequence he had been trying to avoid for years. Preston needed his vote and knew it. Thaddeus knew that Preston knew. Everyone in the room was aware of the specific nature of the negotiation taking place in that silence. Nolan was not a board member and had no standing in the meeting except as the person who had requested 30 minutes to present a technical finding. He was given the time because Celeste insisted and because several board members were uncertain enough to want to hear him before committing their votes. He opened the envelope he had been carrying all evening. The drawings inside were original CAD outputs dated by file header 6 weeks before the altered version in the official project record. He walked the board through the specific divergences in precise technical language, identified the material specification numbers from the original, traced them to procurement records, and showed the serial correspondence between the rejected materials and items on Blackwell Engineering's billing records for Crown Harbor, billed at a price point that exceeded market rate by a margin consistent with a shell company intermediary that Elise's analysis of Preston's financial filings had isolated. This last piece was something Elise had found in the hours between the bank call and the board meeting, using materials from August's secondary archive, the archive Preston had not known existed. Among those materials was a recorded conversation in which Preston's voice could be heard, clearly, and without ambiguity, discussing the decision to substitute materials in terms that made his knowledge of the safety implications unmistakable. The recording was 11 minutes long. Elise played the first 3. Thaddeus Whitmore asked the board liaison to note for the record that he wished to amend his earlier statement about the Crown Harbor incident, and that he was prepared to provide full cooperation to any regulatory investigation, and that he would be resigning from the board effective at the close of this meeting. Preston said the recording was fabricated. 2 uncommitted board members moved their chairs in a manner that was not physically significant, but was socially final. Nolan was offered, by the board's emergency legal representative, personal financial restitution and a position on the newly constituted Independent Oversight Committee. He declined the personal financial component. He said what he wanted was a legally binding commitment to 3 things: an independent construction safety foundation funded by Whitmore Crown and Blackwell Capital in Claire's name, with a mandate to audit projects and support affected workers. Full public restoration of the professional records of every member of the Crown Harbor engineering team who had been assigned responsibility for the incident, and a guarantee that the regulatory referral would happen through proper channels, rather than be managed into a private resolution. The board representative said the first two were achievable, and the third was not entirely within the board's discretion. Nolan said he understood, and that he was not asking the board to control the regulators, he was asking them not to try. Celeste said, from her seat, that if the board declined these conditions, she would resign the chairmanship and provide all available documentation directly to the regulatory authority. The vote to retain her operational authority passed with 11 in favor. Preston Blackwell left the room before the count was completed. Nolan was standing in the corridor outside the conference center when Celeste came through the door at 12:40, and the corridor was empty and lit in the flat institutional manner of hotel back-of-house spaces. The kind of light that makes everything look exactly like what it is, without the softening that the public areas of places like this are designed to provide. He said he was going to go home. She said she understood, and then she said something that she had been composing for most of the evening without knowing she was composing it. She said she was sorry, specifically, for the 7 years, and for the article she had read and believed, and for the particular kind of damage that comes from having a truth about yourself exist in the world without anyone to confirm it. Nolan said he appreciated it. He said it meant something to have it said out loud. He said he was going to check on Lillian. He said he would be in touch about the foundation naming and the formal process. It was professional language, and they both knew it, and they also both knew that it was the appropriate language for where they were in whatever this was. INFT. The investigation took 4 months and produced findings that were, in the language of regulatory proceedings, extensive and material. Preston Blackwell was indicted on charges including fraud, falsification of professional documents, and violations of construction safety statutes, not merely for Crown Harbor but for a pattern across multiple projects in which Blackwell Engineering had functioned as a mechanism for inflating materials costs while degrading structural specifications, with the financial gap routed through a shell company network that forensics needed 11 weeks to fully document. Thaddeus Whitmore entered into a cooperation agreement requiring his resignation from all corporate positions and the forfeiture of certain assets, and in his testimony he confirmed, without ambiguity, that Nolan Hayes had refused to approve the Crown Harbor alterations, that Nolan's signature had been applied to the revised document without his knowledge or consent, and that the settlement agreement had been negotiated with the explicit objective of removing an accurate witness from any future proceeding. Crown Horizon was placed on indefinite hold, pending a full redesign under independent engineering oversight. Whitmore Crown reported a significant quarterly loss that stabilized over the following months, at a level lower than before the gala and more defensible than anything built on the structure Preston had been constructing. Celeste retained her position as CEO under an expanded independent governance arrangement that gave the Oversight Committee meaningful authority over major capital decisions, an arrangement she had proposed herself, which the reconstituted board accepted partly because it was reasonable, and partly because her willingness to propose it had demonstrated a quality the board had been uncertain she possessed. The Nolan Hayes engineering team restoration was processed through the Professional Licensing Authority and resulted in a formal public correction of the Crown Harbor incident record, removing Nolan's name from the liability category and restoring his professional standing in full. He did not return to corporate employment. He renewed his independent contractor agreement and added a consulting relationship with Whitmore Crown's newly structured Technical Review Division, a part-time arrangement involving no office and no title. The Claire Hayes Safety Foundation was announced at a small ceremony attended by the families of the Crown Harbor victims. representatives from the Engineering Licensing Board, and a handful of journalists who covered the construction industry rather than the financial world. Lillian was 15 by then and had her father's quality of stillness, the kind that is not distance but attention, and she stood beside him through the ceremony without speaking much, which was how she was, and which Nolan had always respected because she had not gotten it from him by accident. When Celeste spoke at the podium and described Claire Hayes as an independent professional who had done her job with precision and integrity on the day she died, and who had been erased from the official account of that day through an act of deliberate institutional concealment, Lillian did not look at her father. She looked at the podium, but she reached for his hand, briefly, and he held it. After the ceremony, Celeste mentioned to Nolan that there was a small dinner for the engineering team that evening, the people who had worked on Crown Harbor's original design, most of whom had quietly left the industry and were now being formally recognized for the first time. She said he was welcome to come alone. She said he had always done fine alone. He said that was an accurate description of most of his adult life. She said she knew. When Nolan arrived at the dinner, held in a private room at a restaurant with no valet and no ambient awareness of itself, the people stood when he entered, not as a performance, not because anyone had coordinated it, but because they were engineers, and they understood precisely what he had preserved and what it had cost him. Celeste was already there, and when he came in, she crossed the room and asked if he wanted to get dinner after, somewhere without a guest list or a program. He said yes, and said he had two conditions, no motorcade and no press release. She said those were acceptable. He said the truck would be outside. She said she would find it. They left through the side exit, moving through the kitchen corridor the way people move when they are avoiding attention, not because they are ashamed, but because they have both learned that attention, in the kinds of rooms they had recently occupied, was rarely on their terms. The truck was parked on the street, and the city was doing what it does at night, continuing, indifferent, enormous. And neither of them said anything significant until they had been driving for several minutes, at which point Celeste said it was a good truck, and Nolan said it was. The first time Celeste Whitmore had taken Nolan Hayes's arm, she had done it to silence a room that did not deserve her silence. The second time, in the weeks and months that followed, she did it without thinking, which is how you know something has stopped being a decision.